We left off with George Cuvier and his contribution to the overall picture, which was developing the study of paleontology. And he came up with his explanation with regard to why aren't these animals, why we don't see these animals now, why have they gone extinct, is this concept of catastrophism. He speculated that that catastrophes are constantly happening. They could see that. They could see hurricanes. They could see tsunamis, etc. And they observe volcanoes, and that they see these catastrophes happening all the time, and they see the results of the catastrophes. So that he thought that this must be what happened to all of these animals. Some mass catastrophe just killed them all off. And then you also have uh, James Hutton and Charles Liddell. He then showed changes in the surface. So geographic changes can happen slowly over time, but can be the result of these catastrophic things that are happening in nature. Liddell's principle that these changes are happening now. They could see them happening now, and they must be constant over time. All of these people strongly influenced Darwin's thinking in terms of they were published. He had read them, and these thoughts were going on in his mind as he was traveling with regard to the Beagle. Another gentleman, Lamarck, was putting out scientific thought at that time, and what he thought was that species change. Now, this word evolve was never used at that time, but species changed through use or disuse of body parts. And I mean, we can see that in our individuals. Again, individuals don't evolve, populations do. But we can see, I'm just saying this because all of these were observations they were making. There was some scientific thought or theory going on, but mostly these were observations. They could see that the taller giraffe could actually eat something that was higher up in the tree. And so his thought was the original ancestor, the short-necked ancestor, just kept stretching its neck and stretching until you had the giraffe of present day. And so it's not far off with regard to Lamarck's hypothesis, but it's not an inheritable capacity. And one of the reasons why your book puts this beautiful bonsai tree in, other than the fact that that's a gorgeous tree, and I'm not really sure how somebody can do that, because I've seen small bonsai trees, and you probably have too, but a bonsai tree the size of a 100-year-old tree or something like that is just amazing. But anyway, the reason they're inserting this image now is this gentleman can work on this bonsai tree and create a beautiful specimen, but the seeds of that particular tree aren't going to become another bonsai tree. So he isn't creating inheritable traits by changing and adapting that particular plant for its environment, for his own beauty, actually is what it is. So Lamarck's giraffe couldn't have happened that way just by stretching the neck, just by the mechanics. He didn't put it together with the fact that these traits, these physiological traits, are inherited via the DNA. And that is the piece that definitely in modern times have filled in the gaps that Darwin was putting together in his ideas. A little bit more about Darwin. I haven't really I've kind of said this, but here's a little bit more about him. He was an outside the box thinker, and some of this, and some of this, you have to love Darwin because of this. He wasn't successful in a lot of things. So he wasn't successful in medicine. He wasn't successful in the church for his own choices, I guess you might say. He wanted to be a naturalist. He loved being outside, and that's kind of endearing, I think, because he was he came from an affluent family, and the affluent family of his time, one either went into medicine or the law or the church, and none of those worked for Darwin. So he had kind of exhausted all of his options for a man of his station, and he went to Cambridge, and after graduating, I've looked at other movies or other documentaries about Darwin, and apparently a series of friends or influences basically found this position for Darwin because other things weren't working. And so he took a unpaid position as a naturalist. And as a matter of fact, depending on who you listen to, Darwin actually had to pay to be on this boat, the Beagle, for 5 years. And we started out the teaching time with the path of his voyage, which was quite extensive. That he traveled for 5 years, collected specimens, collected information, drew images, wrote journals, and also observed fossils in the various regions. He had the opportunity to experience an earthquake. He had the opportunity to experience volcanic ash. And he had the wherewithal to be interested in the observation of these phenomena and what they do to the natural environment. So please understand, at this time, at this age, Darwin was an observer. He was an excellent observer and an excellent person to record his observations. He was influenced by Liddell's Principles of Geography, and I apologize in advance for this particular slide, but remember, you can print these slides, you can print just the verbiage in the slides, and then you can also stop the teaching thing to read if you want to. But he was influenced by Liddell's principles, and one of the biggest theories that Liddell put forth that Darwin thought supported his ideas is that the Earth was older than 600 years, or 6,000 years old. And that was the idea, theologically, the idea of how old the Earth was, that theologically that God made the Earth 6,000 years ago. But the thinkers, the scientific thinkers, were moving away from that particular idea. And then he also looked at geography with regard to distribution of particular species. And he stopped at the Galapagos, and at the Galapagos Islands, this is where he hypothesized that South American species had colonized the Galapagos and speciated, had colonized the Galapagos and speciated on the islands, so that the animals that he saw on these islands must have come from South America. They were associated with, they resembled, I guess you might say, on observation. But then he reassessed his observations and then perceived, and basically he's noted for studying finches, for studying finches. He perceived that these species are adapted to their environment, and years later, biologists have looked at Darwin's theories about the Galapagos finches and have supported his ideas with regard to his observations on the finches. And so we do have the finches here. So in 1844, he wrote an essay on natural selection as a mechanism. So natural selection, this is the first time we hear this term, that's the mechanism for descent with modification. But he didn't publish this. A lot of this was very controversial at the time because the thought was still nature was being held with regard to theology, that nature was created by God exactly as we see it, and there was no natural selection or descent with modification. So he was nervous about publishing, again, because of his position and also because he knew it would be controversial. But what you have here with regard to natural selection and the description of natural selection is that individuals with favorable traits are most likely to survive and reproduce. On the upper left, the cactus eater, if you look at, and he particularly studied the bills of these finches. If you look at a cactus eating bird, it has not only a sharp, long beak, but it has almost a hooked beak, able to penetrate that cactus and get the soft flesh inside. An insect eater, which you see on the upper right, has a more narrow beak. Insect eater, you can think of something like a robin that has the ability to flick. I've noticed a bunch of robins outside my house now. They flick the leaves around looking for insects underneath the leaves. So they have this beak that actually can be used as a tool. And then you also have a beak that basically can probe, particularly if they're looking for worms. And then at the bottom you have a seed eater. This beak is a lot like a cardinal beak, cardinals, you know, the redbird cardinals. And that beak is like a vise. It can actually break seeds open. It can also manipulate seeds. But each of these birds that he observed with regard to finches not only had this beak that was adapted to their environment, but they had a beak that was adapted to the specific environment that they chose to live in or that they were successful in. And then a little bit more about Darwin, and we said this before, this is Alfred Russel Wallace, that's his entire name. He received this manuscript in 1858, and this was the impetus to cause Darwin to actually publish his book. He said, well, I've been sitting on the fence long enough with regard to worrying about all this controversy. If I don't publish now, then Wallace will publish and I won't get the credit that I would like to have. And so there is competition, and he chose to publish. The observations with regard to Darwin, three broad main ones that are important for you to have in your head is that there is a unity of life. This is this idea of a common ancestor, that he thought of the tree of life. We don't necessarily think of the diagram that way, but that was his idea, this tree of life, the diversity of life, and the match between organisms and their environment. So these are three broad observations that he came up with regard to his theory. I already said he never used the word evolution. Evolution tends to be a more modern word that is because of there are many other people who have built on his material and have done a lot to fill in the holes with regard to his material. When Darwin was coming up with his theory, there was no DNA thought process at that time, no able to look at DNA and see that humans have some of the DNA that is very similar to some bacterial DNA. We have some copies of DNA that you see in other organisms. We need to stop this now and pick it up on the next one.